Okay, I want to do a couple of short video lectures here on the areas or peoples that are outside of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. So the first one of these will be on the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium. The second of these will be on the rise of Islam. Both of these things had a lot to do with the events of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. Obviously, we'll later talk about the Crusades and other things where these three areas or these three peoples come into very close contact with each other. And so we need to account for some of the developments outside of Western Europe here. So first to talk about what was certainly known at the time as the Roman Empire still, the Eastern Roman Empire. The term Byzantine was only applied in the 19th century, and so no one thought of themselves as living in the Byzantine Empire, and really the name is a rather strange choice. Constantinople, which of course was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was originally a Greek polis or Greek city named Byzantium. And so these scholars in the 19th century to differentiate the Eastern Roman Empire from the previously unified Roman Empire chose the name Byzantine. But again, it has no real historical resonance in the period itself. The people who lived in this empire would have thought of themselves as Romans. Even those living outside thought of this as Rome. And so it's important to acknowledge the continuity of that identity here. And you can see that it forms a kind of reverse C here around the Eastern Mediterranean. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Levant and Egypt are lost, and even part of Anatolia, but the empire retains most of this territory. When we get into the 11th century, there's a sort of further push of Islam across part of Anatolia. Via the sea route, even Constantinople had been threatened from time to time, but they were able to fend them off. But one of the things that prompts the Crusades, of course, is a kind of push here, defeat at a battle called Battle of Mans occurred in 1071 over here. And so we'll talk about all of that later on, okay? But this is still the Roman Empire. And we can really start to talk about the Roman Empire in the East with figures like Diocletian and Constantine. But for, the later developments, the most important emperor of the late antique or early medieval period in Rome is the Emperor Justinian. And I've put a couple of images of mosaics here. Early Christian mosaics, especially in the Eastern tradition, were the most important art form in religious art. And you can see in this one, both of these are in the Church of San Vital in Ravenna, which is in eastern Italy. It was a kind of capital. In fact, it was the capital under the Ostrogoths. But after Justinian's forces reconquered Italy, they set up their sort of provincial capital in Ravenna rather than in Rome itself. And this church was built it was commissioned by the Bishop of Ravenna, whose name is Maximianus. You can see the name up here. And he is celebrating the emperor and the empress. This is Justinian here. This is Theodora. And this really represents the kind of vision that Justinian had for his rule in the empire. So a few notable accomplishments here. Justinian embarked on a program of reconquest of the Western Empire, which was now, as we've seen, in the hands of various Germanic groups. And so shortly after taking the throne, just a few years after, and he had to fight off some rivals to the throne, there was actually a major uprising in Constantinople about 5 years into his reign, but he was able to quell that and kind of survive that. And once he had secured his rule there, he sent troops under the command of his chief kind of general named Belisarius off to the west. And they decided to go to North Africa first. And the reasons for that is, as we've talked about before, North Africa was kind of the breadbasket of the Western Empire. It had the most fertile and greatest abundance of farmland. And so they went to North Africa thinking, let's secure North Africa, and then we have a stable food supply that we can then use to supply our army for further reconquest. They quickly conquered the Vandals and put an end to the short-lived Vandal kingdom, which only lasted for about a century or so. But then they sort of got bogged down at that point. There was a major plague outbreak. It's uncertain what this disease was. This is possibly an early massive pandemic of bubonic plague, but it could be something else as well. But this may have killed, as much as like a third of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Constantinople and other major cities suffered greatly from this. And the resources they had to expend, in sort of fighting off this pandemic, lessened their ability. Plus, they have to recruit troops from the population. If the population is lower because of the plague, it makes it more difficult to prosecute the war. And so they kind of put this whole plan of reconquest on pause. After the plague, they, and this was already underway, but they then set out to reconquer Italy. And they really got bogged down here. It took about 20 years for Belisarius to defeat the Ostrogoths. There's a long, sordid saga to this whole thing where the Ostrogoths are trying to hold on to their territory. And they certainly thought of themselves as Romans too, and so this was seen as betrayal by the emperor. But they did eventually reconquer most of Italy, but at great cost. And this being a Pyrrhic victory, it really put an end to any momentum that they might have had to conquer further territory, and it left the empire fairly deeply in debt. Justinian was a great and capable ruler and an ambitious ruler, but he also, like many such rulers throughout time, tended to leave his kingdom, in pretty serious financial dire straits, so that after him, it was impossible to sustain what he had done. The governing principle for Justinian, and then later Byzantine emperors will try to copy this, was to hold both the spiritual and the secular authority simultaneously. And we can see that in these images from the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, right? Here we have Justinian sandwiched between, we have military troops over here, we have government officials here, and then over here we have churchmen. And so on the one side, you have kind of the symbols of secular authority. On the other side, spiritual authority. Justinian stands between them. He is wearing a royal robe. I think this is meant to be purple, but it's kind of faded to brown. Or maybe it was meant to be that in the first place, but it's obviously a very sumptuous royal robe. There's some like gilded brocade here to the whole thing. He is wearing a crown, and then so these are the symbols of his secular authority, but then he also has a halo surrounding him, which signifies, I suppose, that he is blessed by God, chosen by God, even ordained by God, we might say, right? And the Byzantine emperors certainly felt that they were the representative of God on earth, at least the authority ordained by God. And then this being a church, he's also holding a bowl, and in the church this would have been the bowl or the plate for the Eucharist, right? So it's the emperor who is distributing the Eucharist to the people. And the priests, one of them holding a censer here with the incense, one of them holding probably a biblical book of some kind, one of them holding a cross. Okay, they are there to support Justinian the emperor handing out the Eucharist. Interestingly, Theodora, if we can blow that up a little bit here, you can see that she is holding the sacramental chalice, and so the wine is in her hand, which is interesting to have a woman doing that. She also has a halo and a crown and royal robes. We have ladies in waiting over here, possibly religious women. It's difficult to say, what the costumes represent here. And then on the other side, we have government officials again. This is within the church. This is like the baptismal font of the church, and this is meant to show them placed inside this church, even though Justinian Theodora, I don't think, ever went to Ravenna. Okay, so interesting imagery, and I visited Ravenna, and this is an absolutely incredible place to go. This is some of the best early Christian art, so 6th century mosaics here. All right. couple other accomplishments of Justinian. He, like some emperors before him, we already looked at some of the Theodosian code, this law code, right, from the late 4th century. Justinian went a step further with that and commissioned scholars to produce a comprehensive code of civil law called the Corpus Juris Civilis. That's the body of civil law, which was a collection of like 3 different works. There was a set of imperial decrees over time. There was a kind of codified version of decisions made by Roman courts over time. And then there was also a kind of, breakdown by jurisprudence scholars of all of this, giving interpretations. And then there was even a 4th part, which had the new laws issued under Justinian himself, called the Novellae, right? So this was a massive compendium of law that was meant to, bring to date all of the Roman laws that had been issued for the last several centuries by emperors and by courts. And this would survive not only in the East, but copies of this would make it to the West. And by the 11th century, as we'll talk about later, this began to be studied in some of the schools of Western Europe, particularly the schools in the city of Bologna in Italy, and it was really around the study of this text that one of the first universities in Europe was kind of formed, and it gained a reputation for being the place to go to study law. So that's Bologna. So that law code is probably the most influential, piece of literature in the Western tradition, except for the Bible. So much of even modern European law in Western civilization, harkens back to this law code and takes its cues from that. The other bit of Justinian's legacy that survives, it's really quite impressive, is this massive cathedral that he commissioned in Constantinople called the Hagia Sophia. Here is an image of Hagia Sophia. You need to kind of pretend that the 4 minarets here, if you want to get the original Justinian building at least, you need to pretend that these 4 minarets don't exist, because these were added by the Ottomans later, of course, to turn it into a mosque. But just the central church here is incredibly impressive. It is a church built on a monumental scale, the largest Christian church built previous to the new St. Peter's in Rome, which was, of course, built in the 16th century. And so for over 1,000 years, this was the largest Christian church in existence. The interior space is spectacular. It was designed by mathematicians, and so they made an effort to, they put this dome on there. The dome has no interior supporting pillars or anything like that. So it's meant to bring together the circle in this form of the dome, and then you see kind of these round shapes and things, these kind of half domes, and the square. And so this is built as a basilica. You can see the raised central aisle here, which is typical of Roman architecture. There you have a Roman arch, and then these shorter side aisles. That's the architecturally speaking, this is what's called the basilica format. This is something the Romans developed previous to Christianity. It then became used widely within Christian circles. But then around the dome itself, which caps the basilica, you have this bank of windows, and then you have windows sort of all over the place. So, in the half domes here, you can see a number of windows on the front facade. And the effect of this is really amazing. Like the play of light in this building, if it's a sunny day, the light streams through these windows, and it almost looks like the dome is floating on light. This for people not accustomed to seeing sights this spectacular, this would have been an absolutely overwhelming experience. I can say from having gone to Hagia Sophia that it is fairly overwhelming even to be there, just the monumental size of the whole thing. The interior space is 78 meters by 72 meters. It's nearly square. So absolutely massive space and spectacular building, right? Justinian wanted to leave his mark architecturally. This is his most spectacular accomplishment. There were a lot of other buildings built, by Justinian. In fact, there were works by one of his courtiers named Procopius, which talk specifically about his building program, another about his fighting of the wars. Procopius also wrote something that is called the Secret History, which is really a diatribe against Justinian. He seems not to have liked him that much in secret, even though he celebrated him publicly. And this is a work of character assassination, but it's uncertain exactly where that came from or what motivated that. And so there is this sort of dark side of Justinian, we might say, that he was perceived by many as a tyrant or an autocrat. Obviously, he's the emperor. And one who possibly was even possessed by the devil. That's something that is claimed by Procopius. Okay, and he really doesn't like his wife Theodora. Goes into great detail about the scandals she caused, and all of that. So, an enigmatic figure, Justinian, really important. He left the empire broke, though, or deeply in debt. Here's some interior mosaics. Much of this was covered up. But, this is, here we have Constantine holding one church. This is the church, one of the churches that Constantine built, or this may represent the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I'm not sure. And then over here you have, Justinianus, that's what the Greek says, and he is holding Hagia Sophia, right? And then, of course, he's with the Madonna, they're with the Madonna and Child. So some of the mosaics have been uncovered after this was, when it became a mosque, they covered over these mosaics. When it became a museum in the 20th century, they uncovered this, and now apparently the Turkish government is trying to turn this back into a mosque, and so we'll see what happens to these priceless artworks. Here you can see more shots of the interior of the whole thing. Okay. Last comment, one of the things that exposes the Byzantine Empire to, or sort of leaves it exposed, I should say, is these incessant wars that it was fighting against Persia. There was a dynasty of Persian emperors called the Sassanids, who came to power in the 3rd century and had fought against the Romans for several centuries. An emperor who ruled for about 30 years, roughly a century after Justinian, whose name was Heraclius. He fought a series of wars against the Sassanids that really ended in kind of the status quo. Initially, the Sassanids had attacked and taken a bunch of the territory over here in the Levant. Even Jerusalem itself had been captured by the Sassanids. Heraclius bided his time, but then counterattacked and even pushed his conquest deep into Persian territory. Took some of their sacred cities. This is their chief religion was Zoroastrianism. But then, they signed a treaty with each other. And by the time that Heraclius died, this had returned to the border that had existed previous to all of these wars. But this was right at the time when Islam had been formed by Muhammad, and Muhammad, died about a decade before Heraclius did, and these armies inspired by this new religion were already coming out of the desert, attacking the densely populated regions along the coast here, and taking control of these territories, right? So this warfare between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire were a major factor in the success of the Islamic conquests. And both of these empires fell, or at least, the Sassanid Empire fell completely. The Byzantine Empire lost almost all of its territory in North Africa and in the Levant region, and even, as I said earlier, part of Anatolia. The Muslims eventually conquered Sicily and even part of southern Italy. And, a lot of the Mediterranean fell into the hands of Muslim pirates, who even threatened from time to time Constantinople. It was due to some military innovations, especially Greek fire, which is a preparation of phosphorus that burns in water, that the Byzantines were able to fend off Muslim invasion after Muslim invasion that came from the sea. And, the Byzantine Empire even recovered in the 10th century. The most successful later emperor is Basil II, called Basil the Bulgar Slayer, who waged a number of military campaigns into the Balkan Peninsula to gain, to extend Byzantine territory here, right? So They did have later successful chapters, but they were never able to regain territory in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is one of the reasons. This is one of the things that certainly inspires the Crusades, as we'll talk about. Okay, so I think I'm going to end there. Yeah, we'll talk about Islam in the next video lecture.